Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by SMS. In today's webinar, we're going to take a further look into why Azure Storage is one of the best competitors, what separates it from others, and just a further deeper delve into it. Before I hand you over to today's presenter, Tim, I want to tell you a little bit more about us. But first, of course, as usual, if you're watching us live and want to get involved, just drop any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to answer them towards the end of today's webinar. So a little bit more about us. So we are a modern work solution partner specializing in providing managed services for mid-market clients and SME. SMS has been established for over 15 years with a portfolio of over 4,500 clients. SMS are ISO 9001 and 27001 certified. We of course provide 24/7 support with all our staff UK based, and we are ideally placed to offer the IT advice for your business for its success. And we are here to help you get the most out of products like Azure, Microsoft 365 and Modern Workplace. And talking of Azure, I will hand you over now to Tim to tell you a little bit more about Azure Storage.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to this afternoon's webinar on Azure Storage. So my name's Tim Crumpler. I'm one of the Network Operations Center engineers here at SMS. And I'll be taking you through the webinar today. Next slide, please, Josh. Thank you. So let's just have a look at some of the topics we're going to be covering in this webinar today. And the idea is just to give you a general overview of what Azure Storage can offer you in terms of solutions that you may not be aware of. So we'll be looking at what is Azure Storage, first and foremost, and then we will move on to why you should use it. What sort of Azure data storage services are offered by the platform, the Azure file storage tiers, so the different levels of storage that are offered to you as the client to fit your requirements, the security that is in place and can be configured along with the Azure storage, and finally we will look at Azure storage data migration. Okay, so what is Azure Storage? Azure Storage Platform is Microsoft's cloud storage solution for modern data storage scenarios. That's kind of a blanket sentence, but to break it down into categories, as you can see there by the icons in the middle of the screen, it offers different varieties of services and storage. So Azure Storage offers things like queue storage. So if your application has a messaging component that you would like to offload to the cloud, that is a service that is offered by Azure Storage. Table storage, which is for structured data supporting database applications. Blob storage, which is a store for files and unstructured data, so it could be any binary file data. Also offers a file storage solution, which is designed to offer a replacement facility instead of a file server type environment that you may have on site in the form of shared folders and mapped drives. And disk storage. Disk storage refers to things like if you've got virtual machines and you're storing their virtual hard drives in the cloud, and also other volumes of disk images that may be required to be mounted for particular applications. Next slide, please, Josh. Okay, so why should you use Azure Storage? Azure Storage is durable and highly available. So as default, Azure Storage is at least configured to be redundant at the local level. So what that means in reality is there will be redundant hard drives in a server rack in a data center, but it will scale from that being the lowest end solution to scale up to become globally redundant. So you actually have the storage services configured in separate data centers, which may be in different regions of the same country, or they may possibly be in other countries, depending on how you would like your highly available solution to be configured. And that protects against such things as natural disasters, such as earthquakes, floods, and all those things that can unfortunately take out those services that depend on the Azure storage. Azure storage is secure. Your data is encrypted by the storage service as default. Encryption options are available both at rest and in transit. And what that means is data at rest, if you think of it as data that is written to a hard drive and is not being accessed. So essentially, it's not actively been read or written to, it is just in a stationary state. And then obviously transit, when data may be read or written to and transmitted to elsewhere, an external source, that can also be encrypted depending on your requirements. Azure Storage also provides fine-grained control to enable you to configure your user access to your data. And we'll look a bit more at that in the security section in a little while. Azure Storage is scalable and is designed to be massively scalable. And so the default upper limit storage for Azure Storage accounts is 5 petabytes, which is that is typically more than most companies will ever use. However, the sky's the limit. So in special cases, on request, that limit could be increased if required. The Azure storage system is managed. And so what that means is the actual physical hardware and the maintenance that is associated and security updates and maintenance that is associated with the underlying platform that serves Azure storage is all taken care of in the background. You no longer have to worry about keeping on top of updates and somebody going out in the middle of the night if a drive's gone down or part of a server's gone down. The system is redundant and kept up to date as possible. Azure storage is also designed to be accessible. So accessible means anywhere in the world. So basically, if it is configured as such, if you are anywhere in the world and you have access to a web browser using the HTTPS protocol, you would be able to access your data. Also, client libraries exists for programming requirements, and they currently exist for .NET, Java, Node.js, Python, PHP, Ruby, Go, and REST APIs. So they can be integrated with your own applications should it be a requirement. PowerShell, Azure CLI, and Azure Portal and Azure Storage Explorer all provide windows into the Azure Storage platform. So you have multiple options to view your data as well as having access to it. And also, the final point on why Azure Storage is cost versus competitors. Azure Storage costings can be very competitive compared with other cloud service providers, and the big names are obviously Google and Amazon. Amazon Web Services typically are a fair bit more costly than the Azure Storage platform, because if you currently own your own Windows licenses, these can be offset against your Azure Storage server setup, so you will not have to repurchase any operating systems that you have licenses for in the cloud. With Amazon Web Services, you will do. You have to repurchase them specifically for servers you want to run. So there can be some very good cost savings there. Next slide, please, Josh. Okay, so we briefly mentioned at the beginning the Azure Storage Data Services. So just having a little bit more closer look at these. So Azure Blobs, the definition is a massively scalable object store for text and binary data. So as we were saying earlier, it's unstructured data. So if you have data that is essentially files that are they are unstructured and they don't tie into any particular system or database, that can be used for a store. Azure Files, we again briefly touched on that earlier. This takes the form of managed file shares for cloud or on-premise deployments. So the typical example of this is if you have an on-premises file server and you have shared drives or mapped network drives, currently the Azure Files is the solution that will replace that current on-premises file server. Azure Queues, a messaging store for reliable messaging between application components. So as we mentioned, if you have applications with a messaging component and you want to offload those queues for your application, then Azure Storage provides this feature for you. Azure Tables, natively a NoSQL store for schemaless storage and of structured data. As default, it is NoSQL. It is possible to have other SQL-based databases as well running in Azure Storage, and the tables that provide the integration for those applications. Azure Managed Disks, block level storage volumes for Azure virtual machines. So if you have virtual machines in the cloud, you don't necessarily have to have them as a standalone entity. You can use Azure Storage solutions to store disk images or volume images of workstations and different infrastructure virtual machines you may have in the cloud, which can be very beneficial when you don't have to store hundreds of gigabytes of data on premises. And the last entry is Azure Elastic SAN, which is currently in a preview stroke testing stage, but it is a fully integrated solution that simplifies deploying, scaling, and managing and configuring a storage area network in Azure. So whereby you could use solutions such as NetApp in the past to create your own storage network of varying different devices. This is an aspect that is currently being worked on and developed in Azure Storage Services. So that is something to watch out for as it progresses in the future. Next, please, Josh. Okay. If we have a look at the Azure file storage tiers. So tiers, these are the levels of storage that are offered to you as an end user, depending on what your requirements are. And these come in 4 flavors. So provides premium, hot, cool, and archive tiers, depending on your requirements. The premium tier, which is the highest level, is designed for high performance applications. These storage accounts are run and operated on solid state disk drives to achieve the fastest response times possible for your applications. The hot tier is an online tier optimized for storing data that is accessed or modified frequently. The hot tier also has the highest storage costs but the lowest access costs. So the hot tier is for data that you, for example, would access on a daily basis. That is what is classified as the hot tier. Cool tier, an online tier optimized for storing data that is infrequently accessed or modified. Data in the cool tier should be stored for a minimum of 30 days. The cool tier has lower storage costs and higher access costs compared to the hot tier. So an example of a cool tier may be you take a backup of a server, say once a month, or maybe you take a backup every day, but you have another monthly backup. That is an ideal candidate for the cool tier, as it would be backed up and you may need to access it, but it's less accessed than say the hot tier daily requirements would be. And the archive tier, an offline archive tier optimized for storing data that is rarely accessed and has flexible latency requirements on the order of hours. Data in the archive tier should be stored for a minimum of 180 days. So again, if you have server backups, for example, that are taken every 6 months, maybe 12 months, or maybe it's backups kept for company record purposes for 5 to 10 years, that is an ideal candidate for the archive tier, as it's backed up, it's stored away, but it won't be accessed unless absolutely necessary. Next slide, please, Josh. Okay, let's have a little look at the Azure storage security. So every request to Azure Storage is interrogated and then authorized or denied. The Azure Active Directory integration for blob, queue, and table data. Okay, so the storage types that we were talking about earlier, or the blob unstructured data, the messaging application queues, and the database table data can all be integrated on a security level with the Azure Active Directory, which obviously sits in the cloud as the top platform with Azure. Azure Active Directory authorization over server messaging block for Azure files. Okay, this one actually ties in with the one below it as well, but this statement, Azure Active Directory authorization over server messaging block for Azure files, that just gives an indication that the server messaging block protocol is widely used and is generally accepted to be a good method of providing secure access to file data in stores. The authorization with shared key. So if you remember back to what I was saying earlier about the Azure shared files that is the replacement for the on-premises file server, how the shared key works is with those shared folders, at the time you created in Azure 2 authorization keys, which are shared access signatures. What this means is with a single key, hence the shared access, all users that are granted the key access can access the Azure stored data. So you don't have to configure for every single user their access rights to a particular store. And because you create 2 shared access signatures when the account is first set up, these keys can be rotated on a time basis to further enhance security over time. And Azure Active Directory domain services with Azure NetApp files. So again, NetApp files and the NetApp system can be integrated with Active Domain Directory services in Azure. So that can provide more granular control of how users are granted access to those NetApp files. Next slide, please, Josh. Okay, so we've had a brief look and talked about the types and what those mean. So now we come on to the section of, okay, I've got all my data. How do I get it up into the cloud? This nebulous cloud. So you've got a couple of options here, really. If your current setup permits you to transfer the data to Azure Storage accounts over the internet, then if time is not a limitation, particularly, and if there are no further costs imposed, for example, by broadband operators on usage, then as long as it is planned correctly and considered, transferring the data over the internet to the storage account can be a very attractive option. That's the first option. If you have hundreds of gigabytes of data, maybe terabytes of data, and it just isn't practical to transfer that data over the internet for time reasons, for cost reasons, for operational reasons. Just most businesses, if they want continued uptime, won't tolerate that amount of downtime to move the data over the internet. In that scenario, Microsoft do have what they call a data import service. And in that import service, you physically copy the data you want to move to the Azure data migration onto local hard drives, which are then encrypted, and then they are dispatched, couriered direct to the data center, and they are physically copied over by the personnel on site at the Microsoft data center, which can be a lot quicker than option 1 of having to move this data over the internet. So there is obviously a cost associated with this, which is fairly minimal, but it can be a very useful option in scenarios where time and cost and continued operation is critical. Next slide, please, Josh. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. That was a fantastic insight. I've learnt a lot there myself. So what I'll do is I'll hand back over to me. Fantastic. Again, thank you, Tim. Fantastic webinar. Thank you everyone for watching today. We've got a new one coming up in a couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that. And we'll see you then. Thank you. Bye-bye.